Hello everybody, hi. Welcome to the second brief video lecture. This is about street transvestite action revolutionaries, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson. So I had a decision to make with regards to what movies to set you this week, because there is this big budget doc on Netflix about this stuff. It's called The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, and it's by this dude David France. David France is probably the biggest name in LGBTQ doc making. He also did a film about the AIDS crisis called How to Survive a Plague that you might have heard of. Every AIDS activist I know, every former member of ACT UP, is basically really furious about that documentary because they say it basically turns a story about how weirdo queers organised to change the world into a story about how scientists saved us. And in a similar way, every trans activist or veteran of the Stonewall riots or queer organising in the 70s is kind of furious about this new David France film. And there's basically kind of two reasons why. One is the history of how the film got made, which is that he basically ripped off this amazing trans woman of colour activist and researcher called Tourmaline, previously known as Raina Gossett, who did a lot of amazing work kind of digging up the story of Marsha and Sylvia. And if they're kind of these sort of iconic queer figures now, that's basically down to her. She did all this independent research, put all these documents online, found all this stuff, and she was kind of trying to make a film about it, and she got some like scholarship to some kind of queer filmmaking organization, and France was there as kind of the sort of artist in residence and was meant to be kind of mentoring all these young people. And instead of mentoring Raina Gossett, he stole her idea and hired her advisor and basically made a film about the stuff that she'd been making a film about. Raina Gossett, Tourmaline, has an amazing Instagram post about it, which I will link you to. And then I think there's kind of this sort of massive irony here that, like, particularly the way that Raina Gossett tells this story, which I've drawn on heavily for this lecture, the kind of story of Marsha and Sylvia is the story of trans women of colour being forced out of the gay movement by white dudes with less radical politics. And then you have this situation where even when it comes to the telling of their story, trans women of colour get forced out by white dudes with less radical politics. So I didn't assign the David France doc. It has lots of great footage, including, footage you can't really get anywhere else. But its analysis, it seems to me, quite apart from the history, it has this kind of analysis that the most important thing about Marsha and Sylvia was their deaths and was the violence done to them. Whereas I would argue that the most important thing about them was their lives and the things they achieved. So it's kind of a bullshit documentary, but it ate up all the money in the room, like all the funding went to this. And so what I assigned instead are these two kind of weird community-produced documentaries from like the 90s, which are not glossy or well-made, but that actually, I personally find both of these documentaries kind of deeply compelling, and they basically have a pretty good analysis too, especially the Marsha P. Johnson one. So I really enjoyed both these documentaries. I think both these documentaries are great, and I hope you enjoy them. That said, because of the time they were made, because they were made like in kind of the 90s, their focus is a little bit more on kind of the later life of Marsha and Sylvia. And they kind of skim over what was kind of going on in sort of 1969 to 1973 a bit. So before you watch them, I just want to offer you to kind of take into these documentaries some background on the 1969 to 1973 stuff. So Marsha was a bit older than Sylvia, and when Sylvia got kicked out of her house by her family at 11 for being trans, Marsha kind of looked after her. So she kind of has a sort of mother relationship to her a bit. They're both kind of street queens. They're both homeless sex workers. They also do things like kind of forging checks, whatever you do to survive, right? And they're regulars at the Stonewall Inn, which during this time, as we saw last week, was very much kind of a place for street kids the other gay bars wouldn't let in. And so they're kind of a central part of the Stonewall riots. And they're also, which is kind of the important part, a central part of the organising afterwards. In the kind of months after, the year or so after the Stonewall riots, they get involved with both the Gay Liberation Front that gets set up, which is the more kind of ostensibly kind of radical leftist revolutionary group, and also the Gay Activist Alliance, which is the kind of sort of more mainstream reformist group. And they're also the key figures, along with another trans lady, Lee Brewster, in founding the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, which later goes on to become Pride. So they're not just part of the Stonewall riot, they're also like really active in kind of founding the modern gay movement. And it's probably fair to say that within this kind of nascent gay movement, they are kind of the most radical voices. And their kind of commitment to radicalism is part of what kind of leads them to trouble. And interestingly, the kind of first trouble they have, actually, the first kind of big fight they have, is not with the GAA, the more kind of reformist group, but actually with the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, the more supposedly radical group. One of the things that the GLF does, and I think this is in like 1971, but it might be 72, is they decide to, one of the tactics people are using a lot, following on from the university kind of activism in 1968, is this tactic of kind of occupation. This idea that you like take over a building and you do things in the building and you refuse to leave, and that's a way of kind of doing a protest. And so this thing happens where basically a bunch of gay students are having gay dances in the basement of an NYU building called Weinstein Hall. And they've just said, oh, we're having a dance. They haven't told the university what kind of dance it is. And then the university figures out that these are gay dances and is like, no way. And they kind of kick them out and say, you can't have gay dances on university property. And so the gay students are like pissed off and they're like, we're going to occupy Weinstein Hall. And so they do it. They occupy Weinstein Hall for like kind of several days, and they have dance parties. They have like teach-ins where people come and like share their knowledge with each other. They're doing all this kind of cool late 60s, early 70s kind of activist shit. And the university is not fucking having it. And so what the university decides to do, and it's a little shocking actually, the university decides to call the riot police on its own students. And the riot police turn up, and all of the kind of students, all of the kind of sort of white gay dudes are like, oh shit, the riot police are here, I guess we'd better leave. But Marsha and Sylvia, who are, you know, maybe not as much kind of strangers to being arrested and beaten up by the police, are like, fuck this, we're not leaving, they're going to have to carry us out. And so there's this kind of massive disagreement about, like, what do you do when the riot police gets called? Do you fight them, or do you comply? And I think this kind of goes back to the stuff I was saying last week about this idea that, like, you could punch a cop, this idea that maybe you could punch a cop, is kind of, I think, for Sylvia and Marsha, they'd been through the Stonewall riots, this was kind of a real thing for them. And also, they were, like, homeless sex workers. They didn't necessarily have a shit ton to lose in some ways. Whereas all of these kind of middle-class sort of white gay dudes and all of these kind of fucking NYU students were like, oh, we have a lot to lose. We could lose our jobs. We could lose our careers. We could lose all the nice things that we have. And so they walk out, and Marsha and Sylvia stay, and this is this kind of big fucking disagreement. And I think this is a really good kind of illustration, by the by, of kind of why it's a problem to have leadership roles in the hands of even sort of white middle-class people with ostensibly good politics, you know, like me. Which is, even if we have good politics, we also have shit to lose, which tends to make us make more conservative decisions, you know, when the shit hits the fan. So, after this, they kind of circulate around the GLF this kind of amazing document. That's one of the documents I gave you, that piece of paper that's like, do we want gay power or pig power? Basically saying, like, you guys are cowards, you guys back down. And they kind of get less involved in the GLF, and instead they start their own organization that they call STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And STAR basically has two focuses. One is they continue to work with the GLF, also with the GAA, and to like basically protest. They turn up at rallies, they hand out leaflets, they make speeches, they protest things. They're doing this kind of active protest work. And this work around, like, we'll come to a bit later, this work around like legal change. But also, and that's stuff they do that the other gay orgs are also doing, they also do this thing that the GLF or the GAA have never fucking thought of, which is they try and do like basically direct service provision to homeless, queer, and especially trans youth. Which is to say, they just try really fucking hard to get some kind of space that homeless kids can be living in. And so they have a bunch of places that they call Star House. The first one is an abandoned trailer. They then get this abandoned house on the Lower East Side. They kind of pay the mafia protection money to be allowed to live in this kind of abandoned house on the Lower East Side. And they're there for like 6 months or something, I think, and they kind of fix it up. This house is now 2 condos that sell for several $1 million each. It really was a fucking different time in the 70s. Anyway, then they get another apartment somewhere on the Upper West Side, I think, or maybe even a bit higher up. Then they're in Brooklyn for a while. They have an apartment in Brooklyn. They kind of run these series of places that basically any homeless queer kid can just turn up, and they'll let them live there, and they'll try to look after them, and they'll try to get them food, and also they'll try to fucking radicalize them, right? And they're also really involved, relatedly, in like visiting trans people and queer people who are in prison on Rikers Island, and in offering support to queer prisoners. And so this is just this kind of totally fucking different agenda to even the Gay Liberation Front, let alone any of the other early 70s gay groups, let alone these kind of later hegemonic gay groups like the HRC that we'll talk about. Like, their top priority is sex workers, prisoners, and homeless youth. And it's just so fucking like tragic. Like, imagine if this was the movement we'd had. Imagine if we'd had a movement that took that kind of set of priorities forward instead of focusing on like marriage equality and inclusion in the military. They're really doing everything right. They're doing all the pillars. They're doing kind of pillar of consciousness. They're like out there protesting and being visible. They're doing pillar of service. They're like providing services to people who need them. They're doing pillar of policy. Come to that in a second, but they're involved in like attempts to get legal change. And they're doing pillar of power. They're like fucking building community. The reason why they're not, why they're kind of, there's kind of a sort of, the problem they face is kind of essentially just really, not that they're doing anything wrong, but just they have this problem of resources and support. That they themselves are poor people with very few resources and very little power, and they just get fuck all support from queer people with more resources and more power. And you can kind of see this denial of support in like a couple more examples where they end up like basically falling out with sort of more kind of mainstream, more reformist gay activists. The split with the GAA comes a little bit later than the split with the GLF. It comes, I think, in 1972. Which is STAR, which by then is kind of this functioning organisation, has been very involved, along with the Gay Activist Alliance, in pushing for New York City to pass an anti-discrimination ordinance saying you can't discriminate against queer people, like in employment or whatever, right? You can't fire people for being queer. And they've been like the faces of this. They've been doing interviews with the newspapers. They've been speaking at rallies. They've been going all over the place, fucking handing out leaflets or like unrelated things. They've been like working their asses off to kind of support the GAA in trying to get the SONDA, the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Ordinance, passed by, or not ordinance, Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act, passed by the New York City Assembly. And then suddenly the GA, and particularly this dude Randy Wicker, who was featured in the Sylvia Rivera doc that I sent you. He's the guy who has the shop. He's in the Marsha P. Johnson one too. He's in both documentaries. So he's one of the people who's running the GAA at that point. And the GAA just turns around and basically says, okay, we're cutting a deal with some people on the city council. We're going to take out like kind of gender presentation from this thing and try and make it just sexual orientation because we think it's going to pass more likely then. And it's just like this complete fucking betrayal, right? Like, you've been working your ass off to get this passed, but now we're not going to include people like you. We're going to get ours first. So this is kind of this big betrayal. And then in 1973, finally, there's this third betrayal, which is the Marsha and Sylvia turn up at Pride, which, remember, they fucking helped start. And there's this alliance of kind of white gay dude activists who they've kind of fought with in the GLF and the GLA, including people who go on to have like illustrious careers like Vito Russo or whoever, and also these kind of radical feminist lesbians, particularly this lady Jen O'Leary, who for whatever reason, maybe for some ways, for some understandable reasons, have still come to this like terrible conclusion that basically trans women are inherently kind of regressive and bad and represent this kind of anti-feminist kind of version of femininity and should be kicked out of the movement. We talked about this with Sandy Stone, right? They're kind of part of this whole kind of intellectual movement. And so between these two, they're basically like, we don't want people like you involved. We don't want these sex workers, these homeless people, these trans women involved in this shit. You make us look bad. Get the fuck out. And Sylvia Rivera fights her way up on stage and makes this amazing speech that you keep seeing bits of in all these documentaries. You're better quiet down. Where she basically kind of accuses people of being part of a white middle class club and of not caring about homeless kids or people in prison. She's kind of forcing her way on stage and she's basically speaking this kind of amazing truth. She's saying this is what's happening. This was a movement that I was involved in that was for people like me, and it's being taken over by people who don't care about the people who are in the worst positions, who only care about people who already have the most power and resources. And so this moment is kind of, I think, is really kind of symbolic. Like, after this, she kind of has a breakdown. She tries to kill herself. Marsha saves her life. She moves out to Westchester. She just lives in fucking Westchester, doing kind of shows for like 20 years or something. Has her life out there. We'll pick this up in a second. But like this moment, I think, of like Marsha and Sylvia, and especially Sylvia, being forced out of the movement is just really symbolic of something that was going on all over the place during this time, which is this move from a kind of radical, inclusive gay movement to an exclusive, reformist gay movement that centers kind of white middle-class cis people and their priorities: military inclusion, marriage equality, tax breaks, hate crime legislation, non-discrimination legislation, all this stuff that Dean Spade talks about right? Something that doesn't center trans people, homeless people, sex workers, prisoners. All these people are pushed to the margins of the gay movement. And this is the same story that we saw before with the Mattachine, right? Where the Mattachine was this kind of radical communist organization and is taken over by these kind of sort of mainstream reformist middle class white dudes. And here we see it again. It's the same story that these vanguardist organizations are kind of very susceptible to entryism. And it's this just completely tragic moment that symbolizes, for me, this kind of betrayal of the promise of the early gay movement and explains so much about how we got where we are today. And then there's this epilogue, which these two documentaries kind of pick up on, I guess. And I just kind of want to briefly talk about this epilogue as well, because it's just of the irony, I guess. Which is that 20 years later, after Marsha's death, Sylvia goes into kind of a spiral as a result of that, ends up homeless again. And she meets up with this dude, Randy Wicker, who was one of the people who was involved in the GAA, who, like, fucked her on Sonder way back in 1972. And, of course, even with the trans people taken out, Sonder still didn't pass, right? Like, it's not like they actually got anything by betraying trans people. But this guy, Randy Wicker, hears that she's down on the Christopher Street piers, living out on the piers, and he goes and he does this kind of 2-hour interview with her, which is kind of amazing. And basically, I think he's kind of maybe reckoning with some of his guilt around this stuff. And he says this thing in the little short talk about Sylvia. He says, like, this amazing thing happened. My enemy became my friend. And I'm like, you kind of talk like this is something you did, but really this is something Sylvia did. Sylvia fucking forgave you out of, like, the goodness of her heart. You screwed her, and you screwed people like her, and then you kind of maybe saw a bit the error of your ways, and she fucking forgave you and went and worked in your shop and made your life better. But anyway, kind of following this moment of, like, kind of this sort of reconciliation with Randy Wicker, she kind of gets back into organising. And she's just on exactly the same train she was on before. She's basically turning up being like, why aren't we talking about homeless people? Why aren't we talking about prisoners? Why aren't we talking about sex workers? She gets into this big fight at the LGBTQ center in Manhattan where she basically causes trouble because they're spending all of this money on, like, building themselves a new lobby. And she's like, there are homeless kids outside the church down the street. Why are you spending money on a fucking reception desk? And she, like, smashes the reception desk and they, like, ban her. Although eventually they have to kind of let her back in because they realize, whatever. Anyway, she gets into organising, gets involved with the MCC. She starts doing, again, a lot of stuff with homeless people. She's like there organising a fucking soup kitchen while she's getting sick with AIDS. And also, ironically, she gets back into organising around the Sonder Bill. And on her deathbed, as that video tells you, she's, like, talking to people from the Empire State Pride agenda, those assholes, being like, please do not fuck trans people over. Please try to include us in the bill. Spoiler, they fucking don't. Sonder finally gets passed in 2002, and it does not have trans people in it. It is not until 2019, that's right, last year, that New York passes some kind of non-discrimination ordinance that includes trans people. I mean, the thing to remember about ESPA is these are the people who actually disbanded after the marriage equality passed because they said there was nothing more to do. Fuckers. Anyway, so that's kind of the context and the story. I hope that kind of helps illuminate matters. I think you should also just go and watch these movies, because I think these two movies, one thing they definitely do, for all of their kind of roughness, is give you a really incredible sense of, like, just what these two amazing people were. And I hope you enjoy them. And I'm in market activism journals. I'm looking forward to it. And I'll send another video out next week. Bye!